Good morning, dear students. Today we are going to take Chapter 3, Section 1 from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. As you remember, we left Stephen feeling um, stronger than before because he's going through different kind of experience, physical experience. We left him in the hands of a prostitute, and he thinks or he thought that being with her is going to remove his weakness, and he's going to be more experienced. Okay, so in chapter 3, we have a different kind of Stephen. It was December, and he was in his classroom, looking through the window as usual, and thinking of everything else. And here we have a different kind of a Stephen because he's not thinking about spiritual things, philosophical ideas, or he's thinking about his belly. He's hungry. He felt his belly crave for its food. We have him thinking of what is for dinner. And when we have him in chapter 1, you remember that every time he remembers food, he connects it with his mother, the warmth of the house. Here, no, he's a different person. And he even gives his belly a personality, as if his belly is controlling him. He says, for example, stuff it into you. His belly counseled him, as if his belly is telling him what to do and what not to do. And instead of having Stephen in chapter 1 and 2, his brain doing everything for him, here his body start doing things for him. Okay, so we have him thinking about his sin. He calls it different names. He said a cold, lucid indifference reigned into his soul. Indifference. He doesn't feel things as much as before. At his first violent sin, he calls his sin violent. He had felt a wave of vitality passed out of him and had feared to find his body or his soul maimed by the axis. He thought he's going to be punished, but instead, the vital wave had carried him on its bosom out of himself and back again when it receded, and no part of body or soul had been maimed, but a dark peace had been established between them. Okay, there is a peace for the first time from the first two chapters. There is a peace between his body and soul, but it's not an ordinary peace, it's dark. The word dark is going to be repeated all over in this chapter so many times. Okay, the chaos in which his ardor extinguished itself was a cold, indifferent knowledge of himself. He had sinned mortally, not once, but many times, and he knew that. Okay, he was here while he stood in danger of eternal damnation for the first sin alone. By every succeeding sin, he multiplied his guilt and his punishment. His days and works and thoughts could make no atonement for him. The fountain of sanctifying grace have ceased to refresh his soul. At most, by an alms giving to a beggar whose blessing he fled from, he might hope wearily to win for himself some measure of actual grace. Devotion had gone by the board. Would it avail to pray when he knew that his soul lusted after its own destruction? A certain pride, a certain awe withheld him from offering to God even one prayer at night, though he knew it was in God's power to take away his life while he slept, and hurl his soul hellward ere he could beg for mercy. His pride in his own sin, his loveless awe of God, told him that his offense was too grievous to be atoned for in whole or in party, by a false homage to the all seeing and all knowing. So here it shows you clearly that he knows he sinned and he repeated his sin all over, and he could be punished for eternity because of the first sin. And every time he sinned, he's multiplying his punishment and guilt. At the same time, he's not doing his prayers as if he is scared of God, the all seeing and all knowing, because he thinks, what is the use of a praying? If you are sinning, it means that you don't believe in God. Otherwise, why don't you listen to his orders? So he stopped praying, and every now and then he gives the beggars some money so he can redeem himself. Virgin Mary. Okay, now we have a Stephen. He's holding a post in Belvedere College. This post gives him a place in the chapel where he can lead other people by religious acts. Sorry, by religious acts, and he doesn't mind being acting so religious in front of people. He says his sin had covered him from the sight of God, had led him nearer to the refuge of sinners. Okay, who is the refuge of sinners? Here he says, Stephen, although he's scared of God and he is covered from the sight of God, but he's nearer to Virgin Mary because she's the mother figure. She's the refuge of sinners. Her eyes seems to regard him with mild piety. Her holiness, a strange light glowing faintly upon her frail flesh, did not emulate him. He who approached her then, if ever he was impelled to cast sin from him and to repent, the impulse that moved him was the wish to be her knight. He says, even if he wanted not to be a sinner, his aim was to be her knight. It was his dream to be the knight of Virgin Mary. If ever his soul, re entering her dwelling shyly after the frenzy of his body's lust, have spent itself, was turned towards her, whose emblem is the morning star, bright and musical, telling of heaven and infusing peace. Okay. Here he's saying that his love for Virgin Mary did not shake, and every time he comes after, you know, uh, committing his sin with a prostitute, he comes shyly to her dwelling place, shyly to her because she thinks she's everything that piety and purity and forgiveness. But it was strange that although he's away from religion, but at the same time, he's thinking about his sin every moment of the day. It was strange, too, that he found an arid pleasure in following up to the end rigid line of the doctrine of the Church and penetrating into obscure silence only to hear and feel the more deeply his own condemnation. See that the senses in Stephen. You remember we always talked about the sensory reactions in this novel. Here, he's going to repeat it throughout the novel, especially in this chapter. It's very important, the senses. He says here that he only heard and feel everything that's related to his condemnation. The sentence of St. James, which says that he who offended against one commandment becomes guilty of all, had seemed to him first a swollen phrase until he had begun to group in the darkness of his own state, which means that once he committed one deadly sin, which is the sin of lust, he became became condemned for all of the sins. At the beginning, he didn't used to believe in this sentence. He said that Saint James used to say, once you commit one sin, you are accused of all of them. You are guilty of being all of them. He did not believe it. He thought it was a swollen phrase. But then he believed it to be true, because from the evil seed of lust, all other deadly sins had sprung forth. Okay, this is important. You are supposed to know the seven deadly sins that Stephen Dedalus has committed. The first sin was committed in chapter 2 in Dublin with a prostitute, which is the sin of lust. Here, everything is a chain reaction. We have a pride. Pride in what? Pride in himself and contempt for others. This is very important. He feels proud and contempt of others. Covetousness. Where? Covetousness in using money for the purchases of unlawful pleasures. Because he have to pay for prostitute. They don't come for free. Covetousness. Envy. Okay. Who does he envy? Envy of those who vices he could not reach to, and calumnious, murmuring against the pious. He was envy of those pious people. He cannot be like them. Gluttonous. He was gluttony. He's accused of gluttony. It was the very beginning thing that we saw in this chapter when his belly counseled him, stuff it in you. Enjoyment of food, and there is a dull glorying of what? Of anger, which is in the seven deadly sin is wrath. Yeah. Amid which he broadened upon his longing. Zin. Anger, we're going to see him angry all the time with his family, with the conditions, with his team, with his classmates. And finally, we have here the swamp of the spiritual and bodily sloth, which his whole being had sunk. Everything here is sleeping. His spiritually and bodily is sleeping. He's not as attentive and awake as we found him in chapter 1 and 2. Okay, these seven deadly sins are important. You have to know each sin, how Stephen Dedalus is guilty of. Okay, then came the rector during their class and tell them he announced that they are going to have a 3-day retreat. They are going to start a retreat Wednesday, Thursday, and a Friday. On Friday afternoon, they are going to hear the confession of all those who sinned after they have listened to ceremonies, hoping that the sermons that the preachers will give, that they'll change their lives and change them from being guilty sinners to pious people. At Saturday, there's going to be the feast of Saint Francis Xavier at 9. Okay, because this section is going to end with Saturday feast at 9. What's going to happen at 9? Is he going to confess on Friday? Let's see. You see, this retreat was held in the honor of Saint Francis Xavier. Francis Xavier is the patron of the Belvedere College. He is one of the saints, a great saint. He's called the Saint of Andes because he traveled through many countries and he converted people to Christianity. He convinced them of believing in God. He is called the great soldier of God, true conqueror, a saint who has great power in heaven, a great saint. Continuously, he's being called great. He's a great fisher of souls. He can fish your soul from hell into heaven. This is Saint Francis Xavier. Uh, Now, section 1 from chapter 3 ends with Stephen listening to the rector saying that they are going to retreat. Friday is for confession, and on Saturday is going to be the feast for all those people who confessed their sins. And he saw the eyes of the rector as if looking at him. The imagery is beautiful, a flower. Okay, In the silence, their dark fire means the eyes of the preacher, their dark fire kindled the dusk into a tawny glow. Stephen's heart had withered up like a flower of the desert that feels the simoom coming from afar. Thank you for listening. See you in section 2.